Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meier. Could American tax dollars stop funding education? Questions arise after President Trump's vows to gut the Department of Education and the recent layoffs. Here to discuss the future of education across the nation are two guests. Patrick Carroll, managing editor at the Foundation for Economic Education, and Stacey Schultz, president of Educate LLC and co-host of the Educate U.S. podcast. Glad to have you both. Now, President Donald Trump has said he wants his new education chief, Linda McMahon, to put herself out of a job. And with McMahon as education secretary, nearly half of the staff has been cut, and there's been talks of the agency shutting down entirely. Now, Patrick, in your view, will cutting the workforce make the department more efficient, or are we going to see issues arise, or maybe both?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think clearly there's going to be a reduction in the output, right? If you cut 50% of the staff, they're going to be doing fewer things. But the question of efficiency is if you cut 50% of the staff, but maybe they cut 30% of their output, well, then technically they're being more efficient. So it really comes down to a question of how do we define this concept of output and what service they're providing. I think, however, beyond efficiency, there's also a more first principles question of whether the federal government should be involved at all in the education industry. The fact is there's no constitutional role for the federal government in education. And also philosophically, it leads to a lot of curtailments of freedom. And so I think this is an opportunity to have a bigger discussion about the role of government specifically in this sector.
And expanding on that, Stacey, President Trump has vowed since the campaign trail to shut down the Department of Education and move education back to the states. Now, of course, there are legal questions around whether or not a president can do that without Congress. Legality aside, what would not having a Department of Education mean for the state of education across the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that when we reduce federal funding, then the states need to make up that money, right? Particularly when we're talking about the money from Title I and IDEA. We're also talking about the loss of civil rights protections and also an impact on higher education overall. And when we hear the president continually compare how well other countries are doing in their education versus America, a lot of those education systems are actually more centralized than America. And so that's something we have to think about. How would states really replicate some of those roles in meaningful ways while also thinking about what is it that other countries are doing that are actually stronger and better than how we organize our current system?
And Stacey, staying with you, the agency was established back in 1979 by Congress under President Jimmy Carter. Now, President Reagan tried to shut it down, but of course needed congressional approval. In your view, what is the role of the Department of Education? What does it do that that state level can't?
Yeah, I just want to also point out that while Reagan did come in initially and say, hey, let's actually shut this down, he actually broadened the role of the Department of Education. And so I think that's something that, often gets missed and not discussed. However, I think what the role of education, the Department of Education does from a federal level is really around data collection and research. And it really helps to consider the trends nationwide that can inform more local decisions and policy. It also helps ensure that there's equity, right? And that there's access across the country that, states can't necessarily do on their own unless they create some level of coalitions. But then I think that's problematic because states that will want to be in coalition together will probably want to have like-minded aspects of education, which can really exacerbate that inequity and access across, which really does also come down to that IDEA and other congressional funding programs that the department oversees. And we didn't even get into higher education, right? That's just the K-12.
Right, Patrick, actually digging into the roles of the department there. We saw the other day the department's Office for Civil Rights sent letters to 60 institutes of higher education. That's over Title IX or, to protect Jewish students on campus after the pro-Palestine protests that erupted in the wake of October 7th, which ties into another role of the Department of Education, which is overseeing loans and grants. You had McMahon saying these universities need to do better if they are to continue receiving public funding. What do you make of how student loans will be impacted if the department no longer exists?
It's a good question, and there's a lot of discussion around this. It seems likely that that portfolio will just be moved into a different department, perhaps the Treasury. And so I don't think there's actually going to be a significant impact, even if the Department of Education is shuttered on student loans. I think that's a shame. I think that would be a missed opportunity to question whether there should be federal student loans. The unfortunate fact is that many students go to college and they kind of live it up. They're out partying and they're getting degrees that in many cases have questionable value. I don't think the taxpayers should be subsidizing that. I think that we should move towards a system where private lenders provide the funding and a student can say, hey, look, I'm disciplined. I'm interested in getting this education so that I can go and have a successful career. I think this is going to be a missed opportunity because I don't see any real changes on student loans being shut down.
Now, on the topic of education, staying with you, Patrick, Secretary McMahon telling Fox and Friends a while ago that the president's goal is to see our students' scores go up. I actually want to play a soundbite from the president about the state of our schools.
I want to bring the schools back to the states. And, I've said it 100 times, we're ranked at the bottom of the list, and yet we spend more. We're ranked number one for cost per student. We're ranked at the bottom of the list.
And Patrick, given your work at the Foundation for Economic Education, what do you see as the solution here?
Choice. We've tried throwing more money at the problem, and clearly that isn't working. The status quo is just really abysmal. And I think that's because we have this very monopolistic, conformist kind of education system that doesn't unleash the power of the free market to provide good incentives for schools to actually achieve good outcomes. We've seen 15 states have universal school choice, and there really is a movement in this country where parents are starting to explore alternative education options, homeschooling, micro schools, private schools, and they're really feeling empowered to take education into their own hands. And so I think unleashing the free market, ultimately separating school and state, so that families can make choices that are going to be good for them, and that schools actually have to compete with one another and deliver results or risk going out of business. I think we've seen the free market work really great in other sectors, and it could also work great in this one.
And Stacey, on that topic of school choice, we've seen since the pandemic especially a massive rise in homeschooling, something called classical education, and of course, sometimes school choice. The public school is the best choice for people. With your work at Educate, what do you see as the solution here?
So I just want to name at Educate, we support a variety of schools. Both traditional public, non-traditional public, and also private. But from my own vantage point, I think that school choice policy can be very misleading, actually. A lot of times the money that they're providing parents do not cover the costs. And when you look closer at the data across where school choice is happening, it's very uneven in their actual impact on student outcomes. Additionally, I think we're misdiagnosing some of the problems that school choice is trying to say it will address. And therefore, I think we need to really step back and consider what are the underlying systemic issues in education, and how do we ensure we don't decentralize accountability, which is a big concern when we think about private, and also private solutions don't come. They often, if there's not that oversight, right, we see people taking advantage of, rather. Sorry. But I think that that's really important to name. And so what are some potential solutions? Again, as I mentioned, let's look to some of those countries that are actually more centralized while giving local opportunity to make choices. Somewhere like Finland, teachers are allowed to make curriculum choices right in their classroom. However, there's centralized payments, the way that schools are funded. There's also ways that schools are being supported from a centralized viewpoint in teacher training, teacher pay, etc. And I think there's a lot of these issues that we just don't really address. And this idea of doing away with the DOE at a federal level is not going to address.
Actually, expanding on that, Patrick, we've seen concerns from parents, especially since the pandemic, when they found out what their kids were learning in schools. There's the pushback against DEI you're seeing, especially under this administration. What do you see maybe as the role of parents in education going forward?
I think the role of parents is huge. Parents are seeing for the first time with COVID what's happening in classrooms, and in many cases they were very disappointed And the problem is that parents are often they feel very shackled, right? They have to, we're assigned a district school. And so, think about if you were assigned to a district grocery store and the grocery store wasn't very good. And the only way you could go to a different grocery store is if you completely moved to a different neighborhood. That seems to really handcuff parents in terms of their ability to provide a good education for their children. I think what we need to do is give them more choice and freedom and empower them to make decisions for their own children that are going to be better than just taking what the government happens to provide for them, which is often very substandard.
And Stacey, very quickly, what are your thoughts on parents' role in education?
I'm a parent myself. I have 3 children. And so one thing I would say, and I've been an educator for a long time, I think parents' role in education is really important. By engaging our parents and to our community and understanding what it is that they want and for their children and with their children. I think students' role is also very missed in this role of education, and yet they are the ones receiving the service of schools. But I do think we would not in any other role or any other profession say, hey, parents, you come in and run the show, right? The educators are professionals, they're trained, they're knowledgeable. So I think it's a partnership versus saying, hey, parent, you tell us exactly how to do it, but rather, how do we open the floor of communication and create school systems that support our children in the ways that we all want?
A lot to unfold here. Patrick Carroll, Stacey Schultz, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tiffany.
Thank you.